Hello, John, and hello, everybody on the team. It's just lovely to be part of this World Storytelling Cafe and to see all your faces from different parts of the world. Welcome back to Lenore again. But here I am in Cape Town, right at the very tip of South Africa, and it's just a pleasure to bring stories to you, particularly in these times. And I think that's why I chose the theme that I did, because I find in these challenging times, it's the stories that kind of seep into my psyche that provide the medicine, and they provide the compass for me, and they get me thinking, and they get me ruminating, and they really are like medicine for me. So the stories that have been sitting with me for the last couple of weeks, and the stories that guide me, and the stories that lead me on, are the stories that I want to share with you this evening. So, without any more ado, let the stories begin. And the first story I want to bring to you is a story that comes all the way from India. There was once a king, and that king had a very trusted advisor. And that king would go everywhere with his advisor, and he was very much trusted. Except there was just one annoying habit that this advisor had, which sometimes drove the king crazy. It didn't matter what happened. The advisor would smile, he'd lift his finger in the air, and he'd say, "It is as it should be." Now, whether the weather was good, whether there was a storm that came in and took out all the crops, whether there was a troop of, whether there was a crop that was taken out, or whether there were soldiers that came in and raided the king's treasures, the royal advisor would smile, he'd put his finger in the air, and he'd say, "It is as it should be." Whether it was good, whether it was bad, that was always what he had to say. And sometimes it drove the king crazy. Now, one day, the king took his advisors and took some servants, and off they went, away from the castle and up and into the jungle on their horses, ready for the hunt. And they went deeper and deeper into the jungle, until all of a sudden, without any warning, a huge snake uncurled itself just in front of the king's horse, fell onto the king's horse, and the king's horse reared up, threw the king off. But do you know, his boot got caught in the stirrup, and the king held on for dear life. The horse bolted. It ran and it ran and it ran, and the king held on for all his worth. And finally, when the horse was brought to a standstill and the king's servants rushed to help him, they gingerly and very carefully took the king's boot out of the saddle. But half his boot had been ripped away. And when they removed the other part of the boot, they were horrified to see that his toe had been severed from his foot. He was in such agony. All his servants and the advisors gathered round to try and soothe him. And the royal advisor bent down and had a look at the king's foot. And then he smiled and he put his finger in the air. And what do you think he said? It is as it should be. That was it. That was the last straw. The king was not only in so much pain, but he'd had enough. He was furious, and in that moment, he decided to fire that royal advisor there and then, fired him on the spot. The royal advisor nodded his head, and as he turned away, the king caught him smiling, and under his breath he heard the royal advisor saying, "It is as it is." He couldn't believe it. And with that, the royal advisor walked away and was not seen again for the longest time. But in the meantime, the king was picked up and taken back to his castle, and there it took days and weeks for him to heal his foot until he could walk again. And when he was strong enough to walk again, he decided it was time to get on his horse again, and this time to go and check the boundaries of his kingdom. And so he took with him a few servants, got on his horse, and off he went to check the boundaries of his kingdom. And as he was on the edge of the boundary of his kingdom, some tribesmen who had come across those borders saw him and saw his servants, but they saw him in his beautiful finery. And as quickly as they could, they pulled him from his horse and they dragged him across back to their village on the other side of the boundary. The servants ran into the jungle. Well, you know, the tribesmen had grabbed the king, dragged him back to their village, and there they stripped him naked and they readied him for sacrifice. The chief of the village came to have a look. They had stripped him bare, they had tied him to a pole in the center of the village, and the chief walked around that pole, and he looked the king up and down, readying him for sacrifice. But as he looked at him up and down, the moment his eyes rested on his feet, oh, no. He clapped his hands and said, "Get this man down. We cannot have this man sacrificed. Look at him. We cannot sacrifice this man to our God. Someone who has already been cut. We need somebody perfect. And this king has already had his toe cut. Cut him off. Get him out." And so, to the king's absolute surprise, he was cut down from the pole, had his clothes thrown at him. He dressed and stumbled back over into his kingdom and stumbled his way back home. When he got to the palace, he called immediately for his royal advisor, the one who he'd fired, and he was brought to the king. And the king sat the advisor down before him and he said, "I've just had the most extraordinary experience. I was stolen across the border to be sacrificed, and now I see the wisdom of your words. It is as it should be, and I realize now that if it hadn't been for my severed toe, I would have been sacrificed. But I wonder, and that is why I've called you, dear advisor, I wonder why it was that when I fired you and let you go, I distinctly heard you say underneath your breath, 'It is as it should be.' Why did you say that?" The royal advisor smiled, and there he sat before the king, and he said, "You know, I am no magician. I'm no magician, and I do not have a crystal ball, so I couldn't have known what was to happen. But one thing I do know is this, that when we are in hard times and when things happen to us, there is always something to learn or always some wisdom that we can take out of a situation. And for me, now I see what it was for me. Because if you think about it, dear king, I was your trusted advisor, and I was always by your side. I went hunting with you, and if I'd gone with you to check the boundaries of your kingdom, I would have been right by your side. I would have been captured with you. And do you know, if they had seen that you weren't right for sacrifice, I would have been the one next to you, and they would have stripped me bare and seen that I had all my fingers and all my toes, and I would have been next to be sacrificed. So I see now everything is as it should be." And there is my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilly.
This is it, isn't it? It's this being in this place I find myself, we all do on a global level, being in a place of uncertainty. And sometimes I catch myself smiling and I think, it is as it is. Everything is just as it should be. That was a story from India. And I thought what I would do I need to speak up a little, John?
Yes, yes, please. Yes,
I'm going to come closer. I'm going to come
closer. That's good. That's good.
I'll come closer to the mic. There we go. All right. The next story I want to bring to you is a story from Africa. It's an African folk tale. And I find it ever present with me as I take the animals across the plain with you. I feel very much in this place of being in a liminal space myself. So let the story begin. A long time ago, a long, long time ago, in a part of Africa where the grass was short, there lived an abundance of animals, all kinds of animals you can imagine. And it was a time where everything flourished. The grass was green and sweet, the rivers flowed, and the waterholes were full. And as time passed, things changed, and soon a great famine came across the land. And everything that was passed away. And soon the animals found themselves without anything to eat and anything to drink. The rivers were drying up, the waterholes were drying up, and there was nothing to eat. And soon they found themselves not only thirsty, but they found themselves starving. And so they tried. They went into the jungle to see if there was anything to find there, and there was nothing to eat there. They went down to the waterholes, there was nothing to eat there. And so they gathered, the animals gathered together and talked amongst themselves. To each and every one they spoke. This is our land. This is all we have ever known. We have had our babies here. We have had our calves here. We have flourished here, but times have changed. And so we need to move. We need to move on. But a lot of them didn't want to move. They were so accustomed to what they had known and what was familiar to them. But they knew if they didn't move to find food, they would starve. And so it was that the ostrich and the gazelle and the elephant and the tortoise and the kudu and the elephant and the monkeys, they gathered together and they decided to walk across the great vast plain that they had heard of. They were going to cross that vast plain to see if they could find sweeter food and to find nourishment. The lion, however, had decided he was going to stay put. He was king of the jungle and he was going to stay put. But the animals, they gathered their courage and they gathered their strength and they began the journey, the long, long journey. And they walked and they walked and they walked. And they walked until they grew weak. And still there was no nourishment, and still they could find no food across those vast, vast plains. And the days turned into weeks, and they were growing weaker, but they encouraged each other. Until one day they came towards what looked like the edge of a plain, and there in the distance, they could see what looked like a hump. And as they squinted their eyes, they noted that far across the plain, it looked like a tree laden with fruit. And so they gathered the last of their strength and they walked until eventually they came to this beautiful, beautiful tree. There it was in the middle of the plain. The animals gathered around that tree and they had to crane their necks up because it was so tall. Do you know? It was laden with the most luscious fruit. Fruit like purple plums, pink pomegranates, yellow as bananas, ripe, beautiful, juicy fruit. The only thing is that the tree was so very tall that not even the tallest giraffe who stood on her tiptoes and stretched her neck could even take of that fruit. And do you know, the tree trunk was so smooth that even the nimblest monkey couldn't clamber up and get of that fruit. And so there the animals found themselves at the bottom of this tree with all this beautiful, nourishing fruit up there, but out of their reach. What were they to do? They sat down at the bottom of the tree and they began to weep. They wept for their tiredness. They wept for their hunger. And they looked up at that fruit so far out of their reach, so near, yet so far. And just then, an old white tortoise, an old wise tortoise that had traveled the journey with them, shushed them and said, listen up. I remember my great-great-great-grandmother. She spoke of a tree such as this, a beautiful tree laden with all the juiciest fruit you can imagine, with a fragrance, a beautiful fragrance that reminded her of all the most beautiful fruit in all the wide world. And yet there was just one thing. The tortoise remembered her great-great-great-grandmother speaking of having to go back to the lion, the wise old lion, to find out what the name of the tree was. And if they could find the name of the tree, they could eat of the tree. But how did you say we were going to find the name of the tree? How could we find the name of the tree? You were listening? I told you we need to go back. Someone needed to go back to the lion. And we best do it quickly, for we are starving. Someone has to go back to the wise lion and find the name of the tree. Just then, the little gazelle found the last bit of energy she had. She pricked up her ears and she said, why, I'll go. I'm nimble and I'll get to the lion in 2 twos in no time at all. Very well. Off you go. Off you go back to the lion and bring us the name of the tree. And so it was that the gazelle quickly left. All the way back she went across the big plains until she got to the river near the jungle where the Lion King was. And there the Lion King lay with a big, beautiful mane, resting with his tail curled around his body. And what is it that you want? Oh, lion, we have heard that you hold the name of a special tree. Please, will you give us the name of the tree? And we will be able to eat of the fruit, and we will nourish ourselves, and we will be saved. Very well. The lion stretched up. I have carried the name of this tree, and I will tell you. Are you listening carefully? The name of this tree is the Ungali tree. Ungali. Ungali. The name of the tree is Ungali. 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 The name of the tree is Ungali. Do not forget that. Oh, no. There's no ways I'm going to forget that. I'm going to carry it in my mind and I will be back to that tree so quickly they won't even know I've been gone. And with that, the gazelle thanked the lion, turned around and went running all the way back across the plain. But she was so proud of herself, for she was such a fast runner. Of course she'd remember it. Ungali, Ungali. But you know what? She loved the way she ran. She was so swift. She was so quick. And she was so caught up in how elegant and quick she ran that she didn't see the rabbit hole just near the tree a deep rabbit hole, and in a split second, she found herself falling into that hole, hoof over head over hoof, until she landed with a thud at the bottom of the tree. All the animals gathered around. So, did you find the name of the tree? Did you find the name of the tree? And of course, the gazelle had been so taken up with her own speed and beauty of movement, she had totally forgotten the name of the tree. The animals were devastated. We don't know how much longer we can last. What are we going to do? That's when Elephant pricked up his big ears. I can go. We all know that I have the best memory. I have a memory where I can remember every tree on the savannah. I can remember my ancestors. Let me go. I will bring the name back. So the elephant set off all the way back across the plains until the elephant got to where Lion was living. Lion was resting next to the river, but this time Lion was a little twitchy. That tail was twitching just a little, and his mane was somewhat ruffled, and he looked at Elephant and said, I have just given the name to the gazelle. Why are you here? I have come to take the name back. Gazelle couldn't remember it, and I have the best memory. Please, dear Lion, give me the name. Listen up and listen very carefully. I will give you the name, but this is the last time I give a name. You are to remember it, and you are to remember it well. Very well. Please give me the name, and I shall carry it back. I shall carry it back to my fellow animals. Gali. Gali. The name of the tree is Gali. 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 The name of the tree is Gali. I've got it. Gali. And with that, the elephant thanked the lion, turned around, and began the journey right back across the plains. Gali, the name of the tree. Trees. Well, I can remember all the trees in the savannah. And he began to name all the trees around him. And when he'd finished naming all the trees around him, he began to name all the trees of Africa. He had a fantastic memory. And when he had finished naming all the trees in Africa, he was so close to getting back to his animal friends. And it was just at that moment, as he began to name all the trees of the world. For let's not forget, elephants have fantastic memories. Just as he had begun to name all the trees of the world, he did not see that rabbit hole just before he got back to the tree, and into the hole he fell, the very same hole that the gazelle had fallen into. And this time, with a heavy big foot and a heavy big thud, he found himself stuck in this hole. The animals couldn't believe it. It took the monkey, it took the giraffe to get a neck around, and they had to pull and they had to heave, and eventually they pulled him out of the hole. And they were waiting. Tell us, we are about to perish from hunger and from thirst. Tell us, elephant, what do you remember? And of course, the elephant had been so busy remembering every tree on the continent and every tree in the world, he'd forgotten the name that the wise lion had given him. The animals were to go crazy. And in their weeping and wailing, a young tortoise spoke up. Hold it. I can go. Let me go. I'll try for the last time. But you are too young and you are too little. What makes you think you can go? Well, I sat at the feet of my great grandmother, and I have learnt that it takes vision, and it takes courage, and it takes resilience, and it takes remembering. So I will go, and I will bring the name back. I will bring it to you. And so the little tortoise set off. And because he was little and because he was slow, it took a long time. One foot in front of the other, step by step. But as you well know, when we have a distance to travel, we just go step by step until eventually we find our way. And that's what the little tortoise did. She found her way back to the lion. And by now, he was bristling. He couldn't believe one of the animals had returned. He growled, his tail twitched, and he came up to the little tortoise and he said, "Don't even ask me. Don't even think you can ask me for the name of the Ungali tree. What do you think? I'm not going to tell you. Be gone with you." But in that moment, the little tortoise had heard, "Ungali tree, Ungali, Ungali. The name of the tree is Ungali, Ungali." And the little tortoise began to chant and took that into her heart and into her mind. And as she turned around to go back all the way across the plain, she found a rhythm. And in the rhythm, memory. And she began to repeat that. Ungali, Ungali. The name of the tree is Ungali. And she sang that all the way back. And despite her thirst, she sang on. Despite her hunger, she sang on. And even when she got to the rabbit hole, stumbled and tumbled in, she kept singing Ungali. She found her way out of the hole singing Ungali, Ungali. And then there she was, carrying the name of the tree on her small tongue. The animals were fading fast, and there they were at the bottom of the tree. They didn't even see her arrive. And the little tortoise stood beneath the tree, and she looked up. It was so tall. And in the biggest voice she could muster, she looked up at the tree and she said, Ungali, Ungali. The name of the tree is Ungali. And with that, something extraordinary happened. The leaves began to rustle and the branches began to bow down, lower and lower and lower, until the branches had bowed right down, almost tickling the dry earth. And there, hanging on the edge of the branches, were the biggest, juiciest pieces of fruit the animals had ever seen, as purple as plums, as yellow as bananas, as pink as pomegranates, and as orange as the most delicious mangoes. And the animals didn't have to reach up far. They lifted their heads and they began to nibble and to graze. And they ate and they ate until their stomachs were full. And juices dripped down and they felt nourished and their thirst was quenched. And then they picked up that little tortoise and they held the tortoise high and they began to sing and to dance as they danced and sang around the bottom of the tree. And they lifted that little tortoise high. And as they danced, they sang, Ungali, Ungali. The name of the tree is Ungali, Ungali, Ungali. The name of the tree is Ungali. And the reason they sang is because they did not want to forget. And do you know? They never did. And that and that was the story called the Ungali tree.
Brilliant.
I'm going to have a little sip of water. Thank you. One of the most, amongst many of the notable things in these last couple of months, but one of the things that have really been on my mind are all the different faces hidden behind masks. And I just find it extraordinary how, as storytellers too, we use our mouths, we use our facial expressions, and even we are being masked. And I look at people's eyes and I think, who's behind that mask? When I pass people in the streets, it's quite a surreal experience, I'm finding. So this story that I'm going to share with you, the last story before we say goodnight, is a story that comes to me about how we choose to mask ourselves in different ways. And this is a Mexican folktale that's just really close to my heart, and I just have great joy in telling it. So sit back for the last story and let the story begin. It's a Mexican folktale called Cucarachita. There was once a young woman by the name of Cucarachita. She was a cockroach girl. A cockroach girl, you might say? Well, this is the beauty of story, isn't it? Yes, she was a cockroach girl, and she lived in a beautiful house with her mum and her dad, and she had everything her heart desired. She had her own bedroom. She had everything you can imagine a young woman wants. She had clothes that were quite trendy. She had good friends. She had parents who loved her. She had everything her heart desired. But was she happy? No. She wasn't happy. And you might ask why? I'll tell you why. Cucarachita was not happy because when she looked in the mirror, she would look in the mirror. Ha! This hair is too frizzy. Ah! And eyelashes. She would look in the mirror at her eyelashes. These eyelashes are far too short and too stubby. And as for this mouth, these lips are too thin. And then she would look at herself in her full-length mirror and she would shake her head and say, oh, and I'm so short. And you know what, people? It didn't matter what her parents would say, because they'd say to her, but Cucarachita, you are beautiful. We love you just as you are. You are our beauty. And she would shake her head because she knew that despite everything, her parents would always love her. And no matter what, she would look in the mirror and she would feel ugly. Well, one day, she went down to the village, she went down to the town, and just happened to pass a beauty salon. And as she gazed into the window, something caught her eye. Can you imagine? For this young woman, it was a joy. She looked into the window, and there was an array of wigs that she couldn't believe. Oh, there were long wigs, there were curly wigs, there were blonde wigs, there were dark wigs, there were beautiful red wigs. And she found herself drawn into the shop. And there she gazed at all those wigs. Perfect! She had to choose one especially for herself. So she decided she would take the wig with just a little bit of a curl beneath her shoulders. She bought the wig, she put it on, and off she went, walking down the high street, flicking her hair as she went. When she got home, she looked in the mirror. She still had stubby eyebrows, at least eyelashes, still had thin lips, and she was still short. So the very next day, back down to the village she went, for she had seen some packets of false eyelashes. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always wanted false eyelashes myself, so I could just imagine what Cucarachita must have thought. She chose a beautiful pair, a pair when she put them on, oh, they were like cow's eyelashes. They just about flicked all the way over her eyebrows. And when she put them on, she looked into the mirror. She flicked her eyelashes and she loved them. And so the next day, when she walked down the high street, she would flick her hair and she batted her eyelashes and she felt lovely. But when she got home, she realized when she looked in the mirror, her lips were still thin and she was still short. So down she went to the village again. And this time, when she had a little look to see what was there at the beauty parlor, she discovered the most beautiful red lipstick. Ah, red lipstick, wouldn't that be marvelous? She knew that if she painted those lips, they would look quite luscious. So she bought the red lipstick and back home she went. And she looked into the mirror and she puckered her lips. And she painted them with the most beautiful red lipstick. And now she was feeling good. She could flick her long hair. She could bat her eyelashes. And you know what? She started blowing red kisses to anybody who she would see. She was really beginning to enjoy the way she was looking. All she needed now was to find some good high heels. And it wasn't long because she soon had an invitation to a party. So down to the village she went again, and this time she had a little look at the shoe shop, and she knew in order to feel really tall and really quite lovely, she would need to find some good high heels. Didn't take long, and I think there on the edge was the most beautiful pair she'd ever seen. If I were to tell you the heels were this big. She bought the pair, she went home, she popped them onto her feet, tottered a little bit, but in no time she found her balance. And by the time she practiced up and down, Cucurachita was ready to hit the high road. She had her long hair, she had her eyelashes, she had her beautiful red lips, and of course, she had her high heels on. And she swayed down the high street. And as she swayed down the high street, she blew kisses to all those who passed her by. And because Cucurachita felt like $1 million, people began to look at her and thought, she looks like $1 million. In no time, as she was walking down the high street, coming towards her was a very smart looking, cool cat. He had the longest, fluffiest tail you ever did see. He had smart whiskers, and he took one look at Cucurachita and he thought, my, what a smart looking young woman. So he sashayed up to her and he said, well, hello, Cucurachita. Well, hello. You are looking quite lovely tonight. And when I look at you, I just think, oh, will you marry me? Cucurachita looked at him. He had very smart whiskers and a fluffy long tail. Cat wasn't too bad, very handsome indeed, but she was a smart girl. And she said, just a moment. What song will you sing at my wedding? And with that, he stood back and he swung his tail. He said, I will sing you a song. I'll show you. And with that, he opened his cat mouth. And with the loudest meow you can imagine, he let out a shrill and a sound and words that she could not bear. And she ended up having to put her hands over her ears. She couldn't manage it. It was too harsh for her ears. No. Those are not the words I wish to hear. And that is not the sound I wish to hear. I'm sorry, but I cannot marry you, cat. And off she went. Well, not bad. One marriage proposal down, and there she went. She flicked her hair, she batted her eyelashes, she kissed anyone who was walking by her, and she sashayed down the high street until, of course, coming towards her, there was a very handsome, suave wolf. He stood tall. He had the coolest, sharpest ears you can imagine, a snout, and a very handsome smile with sharp teeth. And he looked at her and he said, my, Cucarachita, my, you are a very beautiful young woman. Will you marry me? She stood back. Wolf, it all depends. What song will you sing at my wedding? Ah, easy. And with that, he opened his mouth, and the most appalling music and the most appalling sound and words she couldn't tolerate. She wanted to run. She had to block her ears. No, 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 no. That is not the sound I wish to live with. I cannot live with that. I'm sorry, I cannot marry you. I cannot marry you at all. And with that, she waved goodbye. Now, she had had 2 marriage proposals. Not bad. And then, coming towards her, a very fine, handsome young rat, Raccontino. And he came walking towards her, and he looked at her, and he stopped to greet her. And oh, he was so polite. And Rat took a look at Cucarachita and he said, my, you look so beautiful this evening. I think I'm losing my heart to you. Will you marry me? The 3rd marriage proposal. Rat, I have to say to you, it all depends. What song will you sing at my wedding? Ah, Cucarachita, that is easy. And with that, from behind his back, he pulled out a guitar and he lifted it up and he began to strum the most beautiful sounds you ever did hear. And as he strummed his guitar, he began to sing. The sounds were beautiful, and he began to sing of love and moonlight and sunsets. And he sang so beautifully, she thought her heart would melt. And then finally, when he had finished his song, he took a little bow. Cucarachita, will you marry me now? Of course I will marry you, Rat. That is the song I wish to hear, and that is the tune I wish to hear, and those are the words that make my heart melt. And so they were married. Rat and Cucarachita were married, and they lived together very happily. He would sing her love songs, and she would cook him up the most delicious, gorgeous meals. And sometimes she would sing to him and he would cook for her. But you know, they lived together very happily for the longest time. But something began to worry Cucarachita. She found herself looking in the mirror at herself and thinking, look at me. This is a mask I am wearing. My wig and my eyelashes and my red lips. What will happen when Rat sees me one day without all this makeup? He will not love me anymore. I'm so afraid. What will he do and what will he say? But she realized that if she was to be true to him and true to herself, she would have to find the courage to take off that mask. And so one day, she went into the bathroom and she looked into the mirror and she took off her wig. She plucked off her eyelashes. And she took a tissue and she wiped the red lipstick off her lips. And finally, she kicked off those high heels. And then, with a beating heart, She went into the lounge where Rat was sitting, and she stood before him. And Rat looked up, and he looked at his love, and then his face grew serious, and he looked at her from the top of her head to the tip of her toes, and from the tip of her toes to the top of her head. And he said, "Cucarachita, what have you done to yourself?" He said, when I married you, you were quite beautiful, but I don't know what you have done, for today you are more beautiful than I've ever seen you before. And Cucarachita stood before him, and she realized in that moment that Rat was not looking at her through his eyes. No, Rat was looking at her through his heart. And do you know, they went on to live happily together for many, many years. And that was the story called Cucarachita.
Did you enjoy that storyteller? Of course you did. And if you enjoyed it, like the minstrels of old, we're passing round the hat. And if you have some, whether it's paper or coin, our storytellers would appreciate what you put in. Every penny you put in goes directly to that storyteller through paper. All you have to do is go to worldstorytellingcafe.com. Click on today's stories or click on that storyteller, and there'll be a hat below the story. And you can just drop a little in that hat. Well, thank you for listening. And if you can afford it, we'd appreciate it.